basically you got to where the man was saying to himself, I will build bigger barns.
Okay. So he then, this rich man who has a plentiful harvest, takes his harvest, instead of giving it away, builds up storehouses, which the storehouses, some translations keep storehouses. Storehouses were at the temple. So a rich man, so you should probably be thinking, in their culture, the only rich people were the Sadducees, and that was not a good thing. They were rich because they stole from everyone. Jesus later has a parable about how you rob widows, and that's how you became rich. You rob widows of their houses. But the Sadducees became wealthy on the backs of by oppressing others, by taking more than they should have. They got very rich doing that. Also in Sadducean theology was that's who ran the temple, by the way, with the priests and Levites, but they were almost all Sadducees. They also didn't believe in the existence of the soul after you die. So this guy has this, what we in our say would call a come to Jesus meeting, essentially, or come to God meeting. Then he realizes, oh, your soul does persist after you die. Now look back at your life, look back and see what was the point of storing up for years and years and years all these goods for yourself and not caring for the poor, not caring for the marginalized, which is a allegory of Israel, who has land that God gave them that was producing plentifully. We talked about flowing with milk and honey, what that meant. What that really meant to them. It produced plentifully, and that was a blessing from God when it produced plentifully, but they didn't share it with the nations around them. And what had happened is Jesus ends up pinning the blame on the leadership. So he kind of goes at the Sadducees sometimes, kind of goes at the religious leadership, the Pharisees sometimes. And at this point, he's talking about the Sadducees. So it's kind of the point to the guy who asked the question is stop being so materialistic, but also stop caring about your land so much. It's an allegory for why do you only care about land, and you want me to drive out the Romans so you can get your land back. Don't you realize I'm offering you something more than land? It's like, because there's just so much more to the story than that, because he's trying to offer them what we'll see the whole world, to take back the whole world through Acts. So getting caught up in this very low, kind of this low level of caring about the land so much. What's up, Chad? So then there's
Micah.
Hey, Micah too. Sorry, I just saw Chad's name. And then cross out the teaching between do not be anxious. I love at the end of it. Fool, this night your soul is required of you. The things you've prepared, whose will they be? The theme of Ecclesiastes. So is the one who lays up treasure towards him for himself and is not rich towards God. That was a common theme in rabbinic literature. Being rich towards God meant caring for the marginalized and being generous and being charitable. That's how you. And it's weird because it's not that Jesus is teaching us not to care about money. He's teaching us to care about money. And he would be a bad teacher teaching you how to care about money if he's telling you to store up stuff now, because it's a terrible way to store up and care for your money. So he teaches them how to care for money as the one who lays up treasure in heaven is rich toward God, not rich in the eyes of men. And he said to his disciples, therefore I tell you, so what he just told them was, don't try to store up for yourselves, but be rich towards God. So don't lay up treasure, meaning don't have a giant bank account. Don't hoard money. So if that is what the teaching is, you're probably thinking, okay, how am I going to exist? How am I going to live if I have to? So he, in a sense, tells them live paycheck to paycheck on purpose, although that's our language and culture. He says, therefore, I tell you, don't be anxious about your life, what you will eat, nor your body, what you will put on. Life is more than food. The body is more than clothing. So it says the next logical step was, I know that sounds like a scary act to do, to trust God for your provision and to not store up things for yourself. So I'm telling you, don't be anxious about that. And then he gives them an object lesson of the ravens of the field. We kind of talked about how ravens are, he says sparrows earlier, because that was the smallest and most frugal sacrifice in the temple were sparrows. But now he switched it to ravens, which aren't a sacrifice by any means. They're unclean. But the point, I think, is that ravens are scavengers. They're by nature, I looked more up into it. They actually will track animals, find out where the animals keep their food, and then wait for that animal to leave and go take it from them. So their existence is like relying on finding other. I don't think Jesus' point is to go steal from people. I hope not. He'd be a little inconsistent if it was. But the point is they are like scavengers. You're like ravens who rely on the provision of other things, of other animals.
This was talking about generosity too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So so he's like kind of connects generosity, and there's a few connections in between, and it starts developing this really big narrative of, I would call it perspective on life. which we'll get into the rest of tonight, will be two different perspectives of how you look at life. And for Luke, the way, the tell for how you view life is how you treat money. That's a strong theme as Luke is like, and that's, he ends a section with, where your treasure is, your heart will be also. For Luke, a very strong tie in, you could say, I can tell what you think about life because I can see what you do with your money. That is a strong theme for Luke. Even it gets even stronger the closer they get to Jerusalem, the closer he gets to the ones hoarding wealth, the rich men storing in barns, the Sadducees. They even excavated where the Sadducees lived recently, and they found $10,000 bottles of imported Italian wine. They were wild. If you just see that and you go around the Sea of Galilee where they lived a very frugal lifestyle, you can see the reason for Jesus' rebuke against them. They were just wildly different lifestyles, was the Sadducees, who were very rich and didn't care for the marginalized, which is so interesting because it's like, there's the story about the widow giving the, what do we call them? The mite. The whole, this is not that night, but the whole point of that story, she shouldn't have had only that to give. She shouldn't have been that poor. So she's tithing to the temple.
He commands there will be no poor among you.
Yeah, so it's like breaking a command that she's even poor because she should have been provided for. So the point is, she tithes this mite that she should have had way more at the tithe. So it's a great lesson for how to give out of what you have, but it's also, the point is, she shouldn't have had that little to begin with. So he then tells him, you rob widows of their houses. You're the reason she had nothing to give, because you didn't provide for her while you store up wealth for yourself. Anyway, that'll come later. So then this flow of, consider the ravens, they don't sow or reap, they don't have storehouse or barn, and yet God feeds them. You are more valuable than the birds, and which of you, by being anxious, can add a single hour to his span of life? So now he's teaching them on anxiety, why not to be anxious while you're pursuing while you're not pursuing storing up for yourself. Which of you can add a single hour to his span of life? If you're not even able to do as small a thing as that, why are you anxious about the rest? Consider the lilies, they neither grow, they neither toil nor spin, meaning create clothes, like spin clothing. Yet I tell you, even Solomon in all his glory was not arrayed like one of these. But if God so clothes the grass, which is alive in the field today and tomorrow is thrown into the oven, how much more will he clothe you, O you of little faith? And do not seek what you are to eat and what you are to drink, nor be worried. For all the nations of the world, meaning all the non-Jewish people, all the Gentiles, that's an expression for the Gentiles, all the nations of the world, all the nations of the world seek after these things, and your Father knows that you need them. Instead, seek his kingdom, or some manuscripts say seek God's kingdom. So seek the kingdom of God, the whole theme of Luke. Seek the kingdom of God, and these things will be added to you. So it's an amazing lesson on anxiety, but it's a whole lot deeper than just a quick answer. It's a long teaching on, it's hard, I think we discussed a little bit last week, it's hard for me because we kind of view faith as like a not thinking thing, if that makes sense. It's a poor wordage, but it's like a very dumb thing almost. Of course, no one here would say that, but that's how at least the world views it, is it's a non-thinking thing. It's a thing unintelligent people do. Or it's a blind faith. It's throwing your hands off and not caring, when Jesus is presenting it as the opposite. It's look at the ravens of the field, look at the lilies of the field, look at the sparrows, like look and look and look and know more about God, and understand how God cares for you and provides for you. Then that will be the solution to your anxiety. And I think that's the kind of the kicker for his teaching, seek the kingdom and these things will be added to you. And that's like a harder teaching, I think, for some people, because it's not, God is so generous, he will provide for you no matter what. That's kind of, what do we do with people who weren't provided for? Well, Jesus said, seek the kingdom, then these things will be added to you. And that's hard, because it's almost like everyone's natural inclination is to do the opposite. Seek these things, and the kingdom will tack on the kingdom on the end. Seek the things that provide for life, and then maybe when you get around to it, tack on the kingdom at the end.
The world seeks after these things.
Yeah, and that's exactly what the world does, is they seek after these things and then kind of look how that's going. Not great. So that's kind of the end of that section. Seek these things, or not the end of the whole section, but a summary of his teaching is, seek the kingdom and these things will be added to you. Okay, well, what if we try to seek the kingdom and God doesn't provide it? Fear not, little flock. It's your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom. So if you seek the kingdom, you will have it. Seek and you will find, I guess. But seek the kingdom. Don't worry about seeking the kingdom, because it's your Father's good pleasure to give it to you. Sell your possessions. And this is how you seek the kingdom. Sell your possessions, give to the needy, provide yourselves with money bags that do not grow old, and treasure in the heavens that does not fail, where no thief approaches and no moth destroys. For where your treasure is, there your heart will also be. So it's that idea of, like, again, Jesus he's not a bad teacher when it comes to money. It's not primitive or ignorant or dumb, but it's actually very faithful in honoring money. So he wants you to be rich, but towards God, which doesn't mean it's not he's not pulling a fast one on you saying, oh, I want you to be rich, but not really. It's just, that would be a very ignorant thing to try to get you to be rich in this life, because this isn't all that's worth living for, which is kind of that perspective now being drawn with the rich man who thought there was nothing more to live for than this life, because if it's being personified as a Sadducee, didn't believe in the existence of his soul after death. So he makes the right conclusion. If there's no life after death or life after this one, if our soul does not continue to exist, then eat, drink, and be merry, because there's no other point of living. That's a very logical, correct conclusion, I think. But he then has a harsh reality check when his soul does live after his death. So, but you can see the fruit of that mindset in that he doesn't care for the poor, he stores it for himself. So where your treasure is, or where your treasure is, there your heart will be. We can see where his heart is, as he treasures and values his life now, not being rich towards God. So we can see what he does with his money. So then it kind of, and that's where we'll pick up tonight, is it kind of bleeds into, he talks about seeking the kingdom and not money and not things, and then bleeds immediately into being ready and seeking the kingdom and how you are ready. And then there's two different perspectives, again, on someone who is ready for Jesus' return or not ready for Jesus' return.
Stay dressed for action and keep your lamps burning. Be like men who are waiting for their master to come home from the wedding feast, so that they may open the door to him at once when he comes and knocks. Blessed are those servants whom the master finds awake when he comes. Truly, I say to you, he will dress himself for service and have them recline at table, and he will come and serve them. If he comes in the second watch or in the third and finds them awake, blessed are those servants. But know this, that if the master of the house had known at which hour the thief was coming, he would not left his house to be broken into. You also must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour you do not expect. Peter said, Lord, are you telling this parable for us or for all? And the Lord said, who then is the faithful and wise manager, whom his master will set over his household, to give them their portion of food at the proper time? Blessed is that servant whom his master will find doing so when he comes. Truly I say to you, he will set him over all his possessions. But if that servant says to himself, my master is delayed in coming, and begins to beat the male and female servants, and eat and drink and get drunk, the master of that servant will come on a day when he does not expect him, and at an hour he does not know, and will cut him in pieces and put him with the unfaithful. And that servant who knew his master's will, but did not get ready or act according to his will receive a severe beating. But the one who did not know and did what deserved a beating will receive a light beating. Everyone to whom much was given, of him much will be required. And from him who they entrusted much, they will demand the more.
You want to go first?
Yeah, I just wanted to share just a couple of thoughts. When I was doing some study on this, I was really fascinated that Jesus chose to use antithetical imagery to the conversation that God had with Cain. And I put this in the notes in Genesis 4:7, when the Lord says, if you do what's right, will you not be accepted? But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must rule over it. So I'm just intrigued that Jesus basically is offering the alternative. It's kind of it's return to Eden language. I don't want to get too far into those weeds, but it's what Jesus has come to do. He's come to restore humankind to God's original intent through his sacrifice. So just an interesting parallel there. And then I also noticed that I thought this was a really intriguing observation from wisdom in Proverbs chapter 8, which says, blessed are those who listen to me, watching daily at my doors, waiting at my doorway, for those who find me find life and receive favor from the Lord. So there's some really great Old Testament references to doors that one is kind of opposite, and Jesus brings the restoration, and then one is just a really, really neat parallel to God manifested as wisdom in Proverbs 8. Uses some open door language. You may have some additional thoughts related to doors and the imagery that Jesus is using, but those were just a couple that got my attention.
Not doors Jesus uses, although he said, "I am the door." So that's a pretty significant one. But
yeah, the master referring to the door. Sorry, referring to the door. Yeah.
No, the Cain and Abel thing one is interesting too, just because it's we don't want to get into the weeds of that. That would be a conversation for a different time. But that is true. That is a never mind. Mind turning places. But I like the beginning of that. I think you put in the notes about, it says stay dressed for action, which is our understanding, but the paraphrase of the kind of the phrase, which is keep your loins girded. So make sure you keep your loins girded, which was you just, if you don't know what that is, you just like pull up your man skirt and then tuck it into your belt and wrap it around your legs really tight. They would do that if they're working hard, or if they wouldn't run, but if they ever were just working hard or at home or something like that. But it's actually language from the Exodus when they were to stay up all night, stay awake, and stay alert, waiting for God to act. They ate standing up and they kept their loins girded. So they always stayed ready, which is another reason why it's so cool later in Jerusalem. They're having this moment in the garden in Gethsemane, where Peter keeps falling asleep on Passover night and Jesus is staying awake. And they have two different exoduses in mind. Peter is commemorating the first Exodus, but Jesus is a new Exodus in mind, where we stay awake and alert. But in Peter's mind, we're in the promised land. We've already been driven or brought out of Egypt, so we can relax and rest now. We don't need to stay awake all night. But Peter keeps falling asleep, and Jesus is like, why are you falling asleep? Stay awake and alert. It's like, what are you talking about? This isn't the first Exodus. But in Jesus' mind, it is. It's not the first Exodus, but it's a new Exodus. And that's why it's like, so that's Exodus language of stay awake and stay alert. Keep your loins girded, because, and that's why they also didn't put leaven in their bread, because they didn't have time in their mind. They didn't know when God was going to act and bring them out from Egypt's rule. And so they were always ready. And that's the language being used here of how to live in the kingdom, is have a perspective that Jesus is coming back, and always stay ready for that. Servants whom the master finds awake when he comes. Truly I say to you, he will dress himself for service. The night of watching. Have them recline at the table. He will come and serve them. And then if the second and third watch is interesting, because the Roman idea of watches, there was 4 watches for the Romans, but for the Jewish people, there's only 3. So we don't know which one he's referring to. It could be either. I think he's, in this sense, he may be talking about the Roman one, actually. Or he talked about the Jewish one, and Luke changes the Roman one to not confuse Theophilus, who he's writing to. But it doesn't matter a whole lot. The point of the text doesn't change. So stay awake so that the master doesn't come back while you're sleeping. And then he gives the illusion again, but he changes the illustration a little bit to a thief. If the master had known a thief was coming, he wouldn't have left his house in the first place. He would have stayed there so he can catch the thief, essentially. So you also must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour you don't expect. And then you want to talk about Peter's question? Sorry, guys, I'm operating on like 2 different computers tonight, so this is really weird. This is really strange. So and you guys probably know more about this than I do, but just based on the research that I did, that Peter's question really would not have been out of the ordinary. And I forget the exact term. There's actually a phrase for this, that there's a type of discourse where questions are actually encouraged as long as they keep the discourse moving forward. Oh, yeah. So if it had been a really, I'm grossly oversimplifying this, but if it had been a really dumb question, Jesus might have just said, well, that was a really dumb question, or he wouldn't have maybe responded at all. But he actually answers Peter's question. He just answers it by addressing the crowd versus directly addressing it to Peter. And I'm sorry, I can't remember the exact name of the dialogue technique, but the question is purposeful. And so I think the word Lord here is purposeful. I think there's an allusion back to the parable itself and what Jesus is trying to get them to focus on here, but I could be wrong. Yeah. The question again is another thing Luke does, is he takes a weird question from Peter and then uses it as a teaching point. Because Peter, it's hard because the question is, and it makes sense because just reading through it, of course Peter wasn't reading this, but it's like, and he said to his disciples, and he said to the crowds, and he said to them, and he said to the disciples, like, okay, who's he talking to now? What crowd is he focusing on, Peter or the disciples or the crowd, the big crowd? So Peter says, are you telling this parable for us, I think the disciples, or for all? Is this for everyone listening, or is it just for us disciples? Because he was telling the disciples, don't worry about what you eat or what you drink, I would suggest to people who don't follow Jesus do have to worry about that because they're not seeking the kingdom. So those things won't be added to them. So he says, are you telling this for us or for all? And then Jesus doesn't ignore the question, but he answers it with a parable, and kind of a similarly staged parable, but he adds a character. And I think that's the answer to his question. So he tells a similar parable, but he adds a character. He says, who then is the faithful and wise manager? So there was just servants and masters before. Now he adds a middleman. He adds a manager. And he says, who is the manager that the master put in charge of the servants to make sure the servants are fed? So he just, I think, just introduced this idea of acknowledging their apostleship. It's so he answers his question. And it's hard if it's yes or no that he answers question. Well, kind of, but not in the way that we would have. It would have driven us crazy for someone to talk to us like that. But he answers the question by introducing the idea of apostleship. And talking about being faithful in apostleship. John does the same thing, but it's a whole lot more obvious, like in the upper room discourse in John. It's kind of directed at the apostles, telling them not to fade away, telling them not to always abide in the vine and don't fall away, making sure you stay connected to Jesus the vine and don't fall away in your later years as an apostle. So he then introduces it with who is the faithful and wise manager, whom the master will set over his household to give them, his household, their portion of food at the proper time. Blessed is that servant whom the master will find so doing when he comes. Truly I say to you, he will set him over all his possessions, which is straight out of, so he keeps going through Daniel 7, the Son of Man, and that's straight out of the Son of Man, that those who the Son of Man judges righteously then will rule over the kingdom with the Son of Man. So he says, if you're faithful in taking care of God's household, remember the Luke idea of household is kind of the whole people of God. So that's not, I hesitate to say that, but it's not necessarily us. I think the answer to Peter's question is this. Maybe not that part was about everyone, but this part's about you. It's for you and the disciples, the apostles eventually, once they see the resurrected Lord. And so you are over the household, God's household. If you're faithful at being over the household, I'll give you the whole kingdom. So that's kind of his teaching there. And then you get that division in perspective. And I think he first talks about the division in perspective on money. And then now he's teaching the division in perspective on awaiting the return of Jesus and awaiting the master to come back. And you get to see the fruit of what happens when you are waiting for the master to come back, or when you're not waiting for the master to come back. And when he's not waiting for the master to come back, he says he sees a delay. He begins to beat the male and female servants and to eat and drink and get drunk. And the master of that servant will come on a day when he does not expect him, an hour he doesn't know, and it says cut him in pieces. The Greek is literally to cut him in half. Which is not like it's any better, but it's a different imagery because it's from Jeremiah. The cut him in half is the covenant. It's the punishment in Jeremiah for disobeying God's covenant. So he will remove him from the covenant people of God. And that's what the Jeremiah, I didn't write it down. But it's in Jeremiah. I think there's only one reference to cutting something in half, but the point is they disobeyed and broke themselves away from God's covenant. So they will face the punishment and the imagery of what happens to the animals when you perform and cut an establishment of a covenant. So he's saying if you fail to persist in your faithfulness and watchfulness as a apostle, then you will be cut off and cut off from the covenant community of God's family, just like Jeremiah said would happen. So I think that's kind of what's going on there. Do you got anything you want to say?
Yeah, I mean, I was just curious, do you think this is exclusively about resurrection, post-resurrection time frame, or is there an end time component in play here as well?
Well, yeah, that is a hard question because that's kind of the whole thing. It's kind of like all of it at once, but some parts are and some parts aren't. But I would say this is about them as apostles, but this also seems to be about just anyone in a position of leadership over God's servants in his household. Because the whole kind of mission of Jesus is he's redefining what does it mean to be in the covenant and the household of God. And so I think in a sense this applies first to the apostles and then and I think the reason I get that is because the similar rebukes from Paul to people who are not ruling properly, not that they're apostles, because I think that ended with the apostles, but that they're also rulers over God's people. And if you don't rule well, then God isn't usually very happy with that if people don't rule with people don't rule well. Also because he's shifting the rulership from the Pharisees and from the Sadducees to the apostles. He's giving them the kingdom, and that's why he called 12 of them. He's calling not a new Israel, but a new rulership and a new leadership. And so he's kind of redefining the leadership in Israel, redefining who's in the covenant family of God, and then making sure they know how to lead and rule well. And the way you rule well, and it's so fascinating is like the way because we have all the, million books on how to lead well, but it's like, what if our leading well was more about the future and not the past? Because it's kind of, I would suggest in my own interpretation opinion, that American way is the opposite. It's you look to the past and I'll teach you how to lead and rule well, especially when it comes like government and stuff. It's like we go back to our foundations and we learn how to rule well now. We try to do what they did, and there may be some credibility to that. I'm not saying there isn't or is. Same we do in the church too, is we try to be like the first century church. There's great credibility to that, and we know a lot of what they did, and it was very fruitful and helpful. But kind of Jesus wants your perspective shaped by his returning and his coming. Because the guy who didn't recognize that he was accountable and that God was going to meet him was the rich guy who stored up stuff for himself, and that didn't go well. Or the servant who was over the household who forgot about not the second coming, and that's what we would say, but to them about the Lord's coming, about the return of the master. He forgot about that. So he started beating in his male and female servants. So it's like the way to rule well is to have the future in mind or have the end in mind. That's a lot harder, I think, and more nuanced than just look at the past and try to repeat it and modify it and build on it. But it's more of how you act and live now should be shaped by the future and knowing that the master is coming back at any moment. And that's kind of Jesus' whole perspective. Is he gives this very almost scary parable about what happens when you lose your perspective, that the fact that the master can come back at any moment. But yeah, you got anything?
No, that's really great insight. I think it helps explain the passage. I do think that principles would apply, right, across the board. I mean, the idea of fidelity, faithfulness to the end. There's a carryover regardless of the specific audience, but I think contextually your observations are right. I'm curious if anybody's got any questions or observations, either there in the classroom or anybody online. I think we may have had one chat that came in a little while ago. I'm having a hard time pulling it up on my phone, but if anybody has any questions, please jump in, ask, make an observation.
So it was a request to go back and refocus on Jesus' answer and how it relates to Peter's question. It's hard to answer because Jesus doesn't give a direct answer, which is the problem of why I say this loosely, but it's like we don't like reading Jesus because we don't know what he's talking about half the time. And that's why even like non-believer personifications of who Jesus is like he's always just asking you a question back and all this cryptic, stuff, when I hope you realize in this study, sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's very obvious, just not to us. But this is a case where it is confusing. And so he tells a parable about a master and a servant, how the servant needs to be ready and awake when the master comes back. Peter then asks a question, are you telling this for us or for all? Meaning, will you explain, I think just ask him to explain a little further, is this for all of, I think maybe even thinking all of Israel, or is he talking about just us as disciples? Because he's been going back and forth and he was just teaching about anxiety. So is this for us or for all of Israel? But then his answer to the question was kind of the same exact parable, master, servant, but he adds a middle character, which I think the question may have been, no, that was for all. Now I'll do the part about you. That's just for you. I think that would be how to see it, because he adds the same setting, master, servants, but now there's a manager over the servants who are serving the master. And the manager's job is to feed, and meaning to shepherd, to provide for the servants, because the manager knows that the master is coming back. When the manager knows the master is coming back, he feeds the servants. But when the manager forgets the master is coming back, he beats and abuses his servants. Then he's going to be accountable to the master. And he's going to, I think the imagery, pull him out of the household of God. So it's like he almost says, yes, that was for all that would follow me, that you should be awaiting God's return and God's acting. Now I'll tell you one for just you as apostles.
So everybody needs to be ready, but not everybody needs to necessarily be
and it's like I guess it makes sense just by means of whatever you do is like everyone. It's like, well, you may not be shepherding over God's people as a pastor, as an elder, same thing, but as a leader in God's household.
You're all doing ministry.
But we are all supposed to be watchful in awaiting Jesus' return. But I, in my stage of life right now, won't be accountable for the church I govern, because I don't. But Paul's language later I can't remember where it was, but it's Hebrews, where he says that you have to give an account for the flock that you're in charge of to God. Well, I'm not in charge of a flock. Well, good. That wasn't written to me right now. So it's like kind of that idea. So this, I think, in a sense, just applies to the apostles, the second half, but the first part is about everyone being watchful and waiting. And it's the same problem with both, is the problems that come when you're not watchful and waiting for the master to come back, and the issues that come with that is how you lose perspective and you live in a very carnal and fleshly way and start beating people and getting drunk, when, of course, that's exaggerated. But the point is you live for now instead of living for an expectation of the return of the master. Does that make sense? Okay.
Yeah. So verse 46 then is really the unawareness, the lack of the time, the lack of the hour is really more related to the choices that the servant is making, not the choice that the returnee is, that the master is making. Correct?
Well, yeah. I mean, it's like the imagery is nice because it's so simple. It's just you come back home and the person you put in charge of your home beat all your servants there. Like, well, what on earth is going on? You forget I was coming back. But the resounding answer is, yeah, they in their ideology, they forgot and that you were coming back. And so you will, remove them from their position, which is a very harsh and stern warning to the apostles about how they shepherd and how they lead, and not falling away from that and expecting. And then I think the end kind of ties it together. To everyone who much was given, I think he's talking about rule and authority over God's household. Much will be expected of you, but to those who little was given, little will be expected of you. Actually, it doesn't even have the second half there. The little is given. It just says, to whom much was given, and much will be required from him. To whom they entrusted much, they will demand the more. It's a very confusing sentence. Later, that same idea is used in a different way about to whom much is given, much will be required, and then to whom less is given, less will be required. But,
yeah, that's great insight, guys. Anybody have any additional questions or thoughts or follow-up to what we've looked at so far tonight? Please don't be shy. I really like this quote by Joel Green. And I have to go back and read the entire, his entire thoughts on this to see where he lands on specifically who Jesus is referring to and specifically who is not. But I like this observation that I do think is applicable to all of us as believers. God's granted the kingdom to those willing to orient their hearts and lives around it. As a consequence, they are liberated and equipped for vigilance and fidelity. And I think that's the opposite of what you were talking about there a little while ago for the unfaithful servant, because the unfaithful servant, if I understood you correctly, you didn't use this language, but in essence loses his mind, loses his bearing, loses his way. I think you said shifts his focus, but the opposite is also true. When we're focused on pleasing the master, when we're focused on service, then we become people who remain, we're faithful, we're people of fidelity, and we're people who are vigilant. Like our radar are always up for God opportunities.
Yeah, especially with the shifting your attention to the kingdom for how we live, and if we are focused on the kingdom, then God will provide for us. We don't need to worry about provision if we're focused on the kingdom. And the thing I always teach, it's hard because we work with college students a lot, and they all have anxiety, and to whatever degree. It's such kind of a throw around word now. I don't know what it really means much anymore. Not that it doesn't exist, but it's common. I don't know if it's happening more, if it's being identified more. But so it's like, it's one thing to just tell them, hey, everything's be okay, but it's a lot harder to say, have you been seeking the kingdom? Because you're anxious and troubled about many things, but are you seeking the kingdom? Because then these things will be added to you. It is a stressful thing to try to build your own kingdom. It's exactly what happened to the rich guy who took care of his land. He tried to build his own kingdom, and then he ended up, God took his life. I'm not threatening with that, but the whole point is focusing on the kingdom is what provides the lack of anxiety and provision. The same thing with then it shifts it from focusing on the kingdom to kind of the timeline of the kingdom is keep focused on the return of the master. And I don't know, I think a lot about like, how do we, because the metaphor is sleep, the first section at least, don't be asleep when the master returns. Well, he didn't mean physical sleep. We need physical sleep. So he obviously meant something different because it's a metaphor and a parable. So I was thinking about like, what does that mean for us to be asleep and how we are dealing? And it's like, there's such deep, teaching there of what does it mean to be asleep and not waiting, not actively anticipating the master's return? Because we think of, and that's what I kind of made that allusion to. We kind of think about what happened. We think about what Jesus did for us and is doing for us, but maybe sometimes we don't focus, at least me, enough on what is going to happen. Or people just don't care. I think it's the most dangerous thing. It's just like, stuff will happen. Who cares? You know, he'll come back eventually. Doesn't concern me. Well, it's like, that is what he wanted our perspective built around, is remember that he's coming. Yeah, remember what he did for you. Of course, that's foundational. But remember, Jesus is coming back. The master is returning. That future return will have an impact on how you behave and act now. So if you want to, anyway.
Jaina Lisa has a comment.
Sorry, we had a question.
that, live your life like God is coming every day. But it's why Jesus wasn't afraid of the storm. He wasn't afraid to go to Capernaum with the winds and stuff like that. He was always looking ahead, and he knew he was whose he was, who he was, and whose he was. And so he never had need to be looking back and being worried. He was always looking ahead.
Yeah, I like that. I forgot what I was going to say.
Can you summarize what she said?
Well, yeah, it was a lot to summarize. I might not be able to summarize it. Jaina Lisa had a comment about kind of Jesus was kind of always that way of focusing on the future and looking forward to what was coming ahead. Whether it was, well, it's definitely shaped his perspective, and the demoniac with 2,000 demons and stuff like that, is knowing essentially where this kingdom is headed and how that.
I'm intrigued by trends. I just saw a report that came out this past week that apparently fewer and fewer Christians believe in the return of Christ. So if you go, that Jesus is coming back. I think if you go back, I was just trying to do a quick search here, but if you go back to 2006, a survey that was done by the Pew Research Center. So 2006, there were 17% of believers who did not believe there's a second coming of Jesus. And then that number has increased with each passing year. I think now we're at 79% or something like that. I mean, I'm sorry, like 72%. So that's just intriguing. It's just very, very intriguing. And we read a lot about the return of Christ, the promise of his presence, even in Matthew 28 in the Great Commission. I'm with you always, even until the end. And so I'm just intrigued by that. I don't know if you guys have any reflections on that or thoughts on that, but it's easy to see, in our situation, we've been waiting now, 2,000 years. But even in their context, I don't know how much they knew what they were going to be facing, but when they get into the real genuine persecution that's come their way, I'm sure that their fidelity and kingdom focus, I'm sure it was put to the test. Not to question their faith, but I'm just sure it was just a very difficult time.
And that's like exactly what Revelation is written into, and these people suffering horribly under a new Roman emperor. It's like a terrifying persecution. It's even the date is exactly mentioned in there. 42 months. The suffering under Nero. That's the theme of Revelation is keep going, keep being persistent, don't give up, don't quit, keep running the race. And then if you get to the end, I will allow you to eat from the tree of life, drink from the fountain of living water, to rule with Christ, to all these things if you get to the and persist to the end. But it's also the promise of, I had this, I recognized this today from someone taught it to me, but that you don't have to worry a whole lot, not if there's persecution, that is unfortunate, but Jesus will sustain you to the end is kind of the theology in that, in my opinion. It's that he gives you the grace to be saved, and then he gives you the grace to sustain you to the end while telling you to persevere, sustain to the end, knowing that he who began a good work in you will complete it in the day of Lord Jesus. He will bring it to a completion. He will sustain you. If you're a believer in Christ, you will be sustained. And then when you get to the finish line, he says, well done, my good and faithful servant. Like, he gave you the grace to start the race, gave you the grace to finish the race. And when you get to the end, he says, hey, great job, you did it. It's like, it doesn't make sense, that grace that he gives us. But another thing, I like this rabbinic interpretation. They had this always in their mind too. There's a very common thing before Jesus' time of, so theirs, of course, wasn't the second coming of the Messiah, but it was when you die. I mean, that's the same as Jesus teaching us, and that's the first guy teaching is you don't know when you're going to die. He stored up all the stuff for himself just to die the next day. Like, what a waste. And that's kind of the teaching. But there's this great teaching of always repent and be faithful towards God the day before you die. which seems like a legalistic until you realize the point is you don't know what day you're going to die. So every day you live, be repentant and faithful towards God, because you don't know what day is the day before you die. So always be repentant and faithful, because yesterday may have been the day before you die. So it's like, I love that interpretation of always being repentant and faithful, because you don't know. Huh? Dressed in refraction, yeah. Have your loins girded, yeah.
You know, we could paraphrase the Apostle Paul with this. The Apostle Paul talked about the resurrection. We could talk about the second coming in the same way as a basis for our hope. Without that, what are we hoping for?
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Topic. I wish we had more time to talk about.
Well, we are basically out of time for tonight, guys. Thank you all so much. Next week it's going to be really interesting, because we're Tyler and I were talking about this earlier, that we're in this season of preaching on being peacemakers, and Jesus has this really intriguing line where he makes the observation, "Do you think I came to bring peace on earth? No, I tell you, but division." So plumb the depths of that this week, and do some digging, do some study, come prepared to share your thoughts as a peacemaker who follows a peacemaker who's not always about peacemaking. So we'll see what that's all about when we get together next Wednesday night.